upon where in the world you are, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap today, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of it, you will have the opportunity to listen to the webinar again. Following today's webinar, we'll be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. And we'll take as many questions as we can before the end of today's webinar. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is how to leverage serverless to optimize for cost and performance. Our speaker today is Bill Buckley, who is VP of Engineering at CloudZero. Welcome, Bill. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Charlene, and thanks everyone else for joining. I'm excited to talk about serverless today and tell you a few stories about what we've learned in our serverless journey and some of the things that we've found really useful for passing along to peers or customers when they're asking about serverless. So let's jump right in. So first, I just wanted to give you an idea of my history, give you some context of where my views are coming from. So my name, as I said, is Bill Buckley. I've spent my entire career either being on teams or helping lead and support teams that build software and hardware. I actually started out in the hardware business. Created a few boards for storage systems, quickly found out that wasn't for me and switched over to the software world, and I've been doing that ever since. I've worked in everything from device drivers all the way up to SaaS applications and pretty much everything in between. The last couple of years, I've been writing software that is either a SaaS platform itself or that is reaching in and provisioning software into other SaaS clouds. So I also have some experience with everything from the major cloud providers, your Googles, your Amazons, your Microsoft Azures, to a lot of the slightly smaller, maybe the private clouds over some of the other non-US countries, and even some of the smaller private clouds that are trying to take off. So I've had some experience with some of the different technologies and design patterns out there. And as you'll see throughout this talk, CloudZero is currently an AWS platform. So a lot of the terminology I'll use is a little AWS specific, but I think the lessons are applicable to almost anywhere that you are. And the last thing I'll note is, because I will talk about this somewhere and somewhat throughout the talk, is that my personal belief is that when you're building software, it's an incredibly complex, hard environment, and that I think the best results come from decentralized teams that are working under kind of a lean, agile rubric. And you'll see that I think that's important when we start talking about serverless and the correct ways to use serverless and how to really leverage serverless. But with that, let's get in and start talking about it. So today I want to talk about four main things. I want to start with just why is serverless important. Some of you on this may be new to serverless or maybe wondering why you should go to it. So I thought it was good to start with a framework of why both myself and the CloudZero team really see serverless as an important tool that will allow teams to do more in the future cloud world. Then I wanted to give you the rubric of how CloudZero thinks about serverless, because given that it's a pretty nascent technology, I think that lots of people assume serverless is very binary in one thing, and I'd like to kind of walk through how we think of serverless, because I think it is a good model that you can use if you want to start going to serverless or even leverage serverless more. Then I want to get into some kind of more meaty topics. I'll talk about some of the architectural patterns and some of the design patterns that we find very useful building our own application that we actually often use when people are asking us how they can start playing with some serverless technologies. And then the question we get 100 times out of 100 when people hear we're using serverless is, what about cost? I hear serverless can cost a lot. So I wanted to kind of hit that head on at the end and talk about our views there and what we have done to make sure that things don't cost too much when we're using these technologies. So let's start, as I said, with why is serverless important? So in my mind, product development cycles are your scarcest resource. If you're in a product organization, which, as I said, I've spent about 2 decades in, I've never seen in my own experience a single engineering org or a single product org where your stakeholders and your customers don't have more things they want from you in any given time span than you can deliver on. That might be true for some of you, but I suspect almost everyone could be nodding their head that in the next week, month, year, you would love to be able to do 3 times as much as you could, but generally you're constrained by how many product development cycles, how many designers, product people, engineers you can do. And so therefore, you really want to watch that, and you should be choosing tools that optimize for that so that you can deliver more value in this very competitive landscape. Second, serverless allows product teams to focus on customer value. You're going to hear this kind of throughout my talk, but the reason why CloudZero finds serverless so important is we want our teams, which again are one of our economic constraints in successfully delighting our customers, to focus on things that allow our customers to live better lives. And really, what are they giving us money for? We want our engineers focused on that. The whole idea of serverless is that you should focus on creating business value and let some of the providers worry about other things. There was a great set of articles going around a few years ago that says, in some ways the internet's becoming somewhat of a feudal landscape. And that means that we have the big five providers have gotten so large, whether it be the Amazons, the Apples, the Microsofts, the Googles, that they're really starting to carve out fiefdoms. There's all sorts of implications to that, but one is that they have a scale and a reach and a depth of experience to be able to do things like provision hardware, secure that hardware, update patches, and scale out resources so much faster than the smaller players are going to be able to do, that it's becoming much more valuable to let them handle all of that while you focus on just your customer problems. When you combine those two together, you really get to the central thesis that I would say you should learn about serverless, which is serverless is a tool that removes barriers between teams and customer problems. I put a little parenthesis in there, half joking, but I'm not saying this is the only barriers you're going to have between your teams focusing just on things that your customers want. But at the end of the day, serverless gets you close to that. It lets your teams focus on creating business value, solving problems for your customers, and worry a little less about some of the patching, some of the operations, and some of the other things that traditionally has taken up a lot of cycles in any engineering org when they have a SaaS-based product. So in that way, that's why we think serverless is a tool that you have to understand, you have to leverage for some business context going forward. And it's one that if you aren't familiar with, it would do you well to become more familiar with and see how you can leverage in the future when you're building products and features. So with that in mind, I wanted to then talk a little bit about how CloudZero thinks about serverless. And I'm going to bring up this slide, which I will credit our founder and CTO, Eric Peterson, with originally coming up with. And I thought it was a really great way of looking at serverless, because one of the first misconceptions I often find when I'm talking to people about our platform is that everyone sees serverless as very binary. If I say, hey, we're doing a serverless platform, they go, oh, so everything is in a Lambda. And we think that our view of serverless is slightly more nuanced, and I think you're starting to see this view become ascendant in a lot of the groups out there that are using serverless. This spectrum is essentially saying that if you start on the left, you have the old VM world. Those of us who have been in the industry a while probably remember when it was nice you didn't have to rack your hardware anymore, and that you could just set up a big rack of it and let VMs run on there. Over time, we didn't want to rack the hardware at all. We didn't want to pay for the power and cooling, and you have stuff like EC2. You still have to worry about a lot of operational costs there. I won't go into all of those. I think everyone probably understands that. But as you walk to the right here, you start going into things like Redshift is a perfect example. Great database tool, but all of a sudden you don't have to worry about the underlying OS. You can, again, outsource some of that to the cloud provider. As I mentioned earlier, these are all very AWS-specific services we have up here. That's because that's our domain. I think this still applies for any cloud domain. Things get really interesting as you start getting about halfway through the spectrum and all the way over to the right, whether it be something like Kinesis, which is Amazon's managed Kafka. All of a sudden, instead of worrying about running a fleet of machines and running Kafka, which granted is a pretty straightforward service to manage, but still something you don't want to have your team spending time on unless you are a Kafka provider, you can outsource a lot of that to Amazon. Kinesis is in the middle here because if you haven't used it, you still have to do a fair amount of shard analysis and capacity planning, but you've still outsourced a lot of that. And then things get really interesting when you get to the cluster stuff to the right, whether it be Dynamo, Lambda, or kind of that last 4 or 5 things we have around SNS, SQS. Even S3's there. I find a lot of people are surprised by that, but I think S3 captures the CloudZero serverless mindset perfectly. It's an old service that people don't really think about as a serverless offering, but at the end of the day, we find it's perfect. If you want to store a bunch of data and just worry about policy and the actual data, your team can focus on that and let the cloud provider worry about making sure it's available and secure with respect to your policy from there. So this is the model we use when we talk about it, and it's why as you get into the rest of this talk and I talk about how we leverage it, this isn't going to be all about just Lambda. It's going to be how can we use services that allow our teams to focus on solving a business problem and not worry as much about the operational side. Of course, they still have to worry about some of it, but as much as possible, we want to outsource that to the cloud provider. So let's get into some of the architectural patterns. So first, I wanted to start off with a slide on how most people who have not used serverless imagine leveraging serverless. I have on the left here an elastic load balancer to a cluster of EC2 VMs. You can imagine that running some kind of maybe monolithic or even service-oriented application. That's just a stand-in. Some people might have a cluster of containers. They might have, whether it be Kubernetes or something else, and of course it doesn't have to be an Amazon, but the whole idea here is that if you take a non-serverless application that is set up to be provisioned on lots of VMs, slightly monolithic from that side, a lot of people think that a transition to serverless is just what people saw when they first went to cloud, the old lift and shift mentality. You take up your code from there, you move it over and dump it onto a bunch of Lambdas. If there's one thing that I would ask for people who want to be cost conscious not do, it would be do not do this. Do not go down this path. And this might seem really simplistic, but I know as someone who reads serverless and watches the people out there using it, it's something that comes up time and time again. Just the other week, there were some articles floating around on Hacker News and Y Combinator and on Twitter of someone who essentially took a web app, I believe it was a .NET app, and picked it up from its VMs and dropped it to an API gateway in Lambda, and they were shocked when it cost more, it ran slower. And I can tell you right now, you should not be shocked. If you take your current application, if you are somebody working or coaching a team or own an application that looks like somewhat like the left side, and you just pick that application up and drop it over to the right, you are probably going to be unhappy with your serverless journey. It's going to cost more, it's going to perform poorly, and you will probably run away screaming from serverless. That does not mean you should avoid using serverless. I think you just have to be very aware of some of the patterns that will allow you to be successful. So lesson one, do not do this. So let's talk about what you should do. I'm going to actually step back for a second from talking about any service and talk about event-driven patterns. All of the patterns and algorithms and design patterns that I talk about here are not new to serverless. A lot of these will be very recognizable, but like any set of design patterns, each one is going to be slightly more successful in different domains. And the argument I'd like to make is that going back to some event-driven patterns is the exact type of thing that you want to use in the serverless domain. Internally, we sometimes laugh because although in an event-driven pattern or domain-driven patterns that are emit events can be new to someone who maybe has just worked on one or two web applications and is used to kind of synchronously calling API to API. This kind of pattern is not new to the industry. If anyone out there comes from a hardware background and worked on, say, a PCI bus, having something that emits events and let other things subscribe to that events is not new. If you've worked on OSs, especially a GUI OS, this is not going to be new, the idea of asynchronously using message buses to pass things. The important thing here that you'll start seeing as we pull this all together, though, is if you don't rethink how you break down your architecture and you don't use the right patterns, serverless is going to be a hard tool to fit into your architecture. The reason event-driven patterns are really powerful is if you can pull together small domains and have them emit events, they can run very asynchronously with your other domains. And one of the anti-patterns that will become apparent as you get into serverless is that synchronous workloads are really painful. This makes sense when you think about it. The whole idea of serverless, of course, is that you're only spending money when you're using the capacity. So synchronous workloads means that all of a sudden you're basically paying for one or more services. You have a Lambda calling something synchronously. You're going to be paying both for that other service and the Lambda waiting for it to respond. Asynchronous, where you have a domain doing something and then it's posting a domain event, hopefully to an event queue, again, hopefully something that you have a serverless construct that can handle that event queue, then allows other services, other domains to subscribe to it and then go do their workloads in their own patterns and in their own time. This allows you both to break apart your application, whether that be a microservice mindset, like has been very popular the last couple of years, or just a domain-driven mindset, and allows you to leverage some of the serverless tools in a way that will be very cost-conscious and, at the end of the day, very agile and empowering for your teams. Another pattern, kind of stepping back, starting very basic here, that we often tell very new interns about, or even new customers who want to learn how to kind of start getting more cost-effective uses of serverless is if you've never used any serverless services, or you're very curious about to use them on a new cloud, this is a pattern that we always suggest individual developers or individual teams use. And essentially here, this is the SPA pattern, but it's using a serverless mindset. SPA, or single page application, go create a very simple one, dump it in an S3 bucket, and then have it talk to an API gateway, go to a Lambda, do some kind of business logic transformation, whether it be an ETL or transform the data, and then leverage something like DynamoDB to store the objects, retrieve them, update them, and do your normal CRUD operations. The reason I put this here, and if anyone is already using serverless, obviously this is not as exciting, but if you're new to serverless, this is great. This is the kind of thing that someone can do in a hackathon. In an afternoon, you get something like this up. There's tutorials out there, so if you want to have someone take, or if you or someone you know wants to take a tutorial walkthrough, you could do this, but this is also, you could take almost any idea, throw it at a hackathon, and a group could bring this up in a day or two and really start playing some interesting stuff. What this does is it allows you in a very short context to start playing with a whole bunch of services. All 4 of these were on the right side of our serverless spectrum graph, and understand them. I'll talk a little more about DynamoDB. The other good thing here, though, is that something like DynamoDB might be very new to you or some of your teams. It is a NoSQL database, and so if you have familiarity with that, perhaps you won't need as much work, but if you have a team who is currently responsible for an application that is used to a much more of a Postgres or SQL-based workload, this will again get them exposed to a much more managed service that is a much different data storage paradigm. So anyway, so this is, again, if you walk out of here and you've never tried serverless, I think this is a great way to spend an afternoon or a day and learn some of the constructs and start understanding what it might look like to pull together some of these serverless tools to actually solve a small problem. But that's very simplistic. That's probably not going to help you if you were part of an org today that has a large SaaS application and you want to move to serverless. This is so simplistic that this doesn't really answer, okay, how do I get from where I am today to starting to leverage some of these new things in my context? And for that, I would like to bring up the second pattern that we found very successful. This is the Strangler pattern. As I said earlier, none of these are new to the serverless world. This is actually a pattern that I personally have used in many business contexts. This is a great pattern for taking any monolithic infrastructure you have or application you have and breaking it apart to a new architecture or a new set of tools. As I said, I've used it very successfully in many contexts. The times when I've been on groups that have a giant monolithic, often tech debt riddled application that we're trying to move to more of a service-oriented or microservice-oriented architecture, or even just updating some of the underlying tools. I don't know about you, but it's rare in the business context that you have the ability to just go away for 2 years and rewrite everything from the ground up. So the idea behind the Strangler pattern is don't do that. Take your current application and start taking small vertical slices of customer value, pull them out of that monolithic or the old architecture and implement it in the new architecture, and then route any requests for that area of functionality to that new piece. And what happens is, as you pull out each string, you slowly take the requests, the air from that old platform, the old monolithic or the old one that's running on technology you don't want to be running on anymore. And so you slowly strangle the lifeblood from that. There's a lot of nice things about this pattern. One is it's very agile. You can start providing value on your new architecture or your new set of tools very early. You can also start doing this very small. You can take one team and do a few vertical slices, and if that goes well, you could start rolling on other teams. It's very cost conscious as well. It's really expensive from a business context to rewrite a whole application, get it up, and switch everything over. This allows you to decompose things slowly, and if you do it correctly, you can even start deprovisioning your original app, and hopefully your costs will stay relatively steady, if not go down, depending on your business context. The important thing to remember here, though, is you don't just take an endpoint and move it over. Again, you want to kind of step back and say, what's a domain and what's the correct way to decompose your app? This allows you to be very thoughtful and do it very slowly and hopefully end up with an architecture you can support long-term versus the same architecture on a new set of tools. And that's where the second piece of cost consciousness comes in. Again, you don't want to lift and shift. You want to understand the tools you're going to and then pull out your business context and piece by piece move it over to a much more serverless world and serverless use case in a way that will allow you to provide that customer value and leverage the new tools. So I've been dancing around this, but let's talk directly about cost. I mentioned earlier that if I'm at a meetup or just meeting with some friends and talking about CloudZero, one of the things I invariably mention is that we have gone heavily into the serverless world. Our whole platform uses, whenever we can, serverless tools from AWS. And invariably, the first question I get is, what about cost? I've heard Lambdas can get really expensive. So we have successfully gotten to the other side, and we don't feel as if our platform is really expensive. So I want to talk a little bit about where some of those worries are coming from, and at least how we've, in our own context, managed to avoid some of those costs. So I know I've hit this a few times, but the first thing I always say is that lift and shift's going to fail. Moving a monolith to Lambda probably won't save you money. I would guess that in many cases it'll cost you more money and you'll be unhappy for a whole bunch of other things. I would say that you should not have a mentality where you're trying to move from your current tools to serverless and have cost be the main driver. I think that cost is definitely something that serverless can deliver, but it shouldn't be the main driver. I've already talked about how I believe it allows teams to be a little more agile and focus a little more on the problems you want them to be focused on. But the other thing from a cost point of view is that if you have the right kind of application, paying when you generate value is the real winner here. We probably all have areas of our apps or products under us that don't have very steady load. Those are perfect ones where being able to pay as you go becomes really interesting. So therefore, all of a sudden, I would argue that you want to be choosing those tools for when it results in a cultural transformation, allowing you to not be constrained by those product cycles by working on operational costs, but actually building customer value, and then use them as well as serverless tools that can only be paying the cloud provider when you're generating value, not just having VMs run day in and day out. I think there's some additional ones. Once you're fully bought into a serverless mindset, there's still some other things you have to learn. And I'll say almost all of these on here are ones that I've learned the hard way at CloudZero, because you will, of course, make mistakes. The first one I've talked about briefly previously, but it's worth bringing up again. And this is be wary of synchronous workloads. When you're running a bunch of VMs, your opportunity cost or your actual cost of having one service call a third-party service or either another service in your cluster is pretty low. All of a sudden, when you're paying per millisecond to a cloud provider to run your function as a service, that becomes a lot harder. So you have to be really careful about calling out from your Lambda, in this case, to another Lambda. That's often an anti-pattern or a smell if you're chaining Lambdas together. Likewise, if you're calling into a third-party service that's going to synchronously return you data, you're again blocking and paying to block on that call. This gets back to making sure you come up with the right architectural constructs. If you have a very synchronous architecture, it's going to be a little harder to leverage some of these tools, and you want to be really careful there because you can end up spending a lot of money when you're not actually generating value for that time. The second piece is that a lot of people go into serverless thinking that they can get rid of all operational concerns. Another area where we have personally seen, and I've seen other customers have problems with costs, is if you don't right-size your infrastructure. To use Lambda as an example, although I mentioned Kinesis as well earlier, there's still, even in the serverless world, areas where you have to make sure you're right-sizing your metrics. I've had problems with memory pressure on a Lambda, and if you start failing out your workloads and not doing what you expect, you can get into kind of some death spirals where you're going to be invoking your serverless constructs over and over again, and again, paying for execution time that's not actually getting your customer value. The third one I'll say is, like any new set of tools, like anyone here who has done the transition from on-premise to the cloud, going from a VM architecture to a serverless architecture necessitates both new tools and patterns. I've talked a little bit about the patterns here that you want to think about. A lot of those are going to be service specific though. And as we said, we don't consider serverless just Lambda. So for instance, Dynamo, which I mentioned briefly earlier. DynamoDB is a fascinating service. It's a hard one for people just to come in and use right away if they don't have deeper experience with NoSQL databases. If they're more used to ACID transactions or just any Postgres or SQL workload, it's a little harder to jump in there. We have one of our senior engineers who's been using it for a number of years, gives a great talk on how to use things like the adjacency list pattern, and essentially starting to think about how you can look at your customer data as a graph instead of some of the patterns you might use to represent it into a SQL database. The good news there is that if you can start figuring out how to use things like DynamoDB, you can really make use of some storage paradigms that scale incredibly well, incredibly cheaply. Those are areas where you can actually see a lot of cost savings, but again, it makes you rethink how you store data, how you interact with that storage layer. And on the other side, there's still tools here. As I said, just like when you shifted from on-prem to the cloud, some of your tools had to be updated or how you use them had to be updated. Luckily, here's a place where we're seeing both the incumbent players come out with more and more options. I noticed for those of you who use Datadog, they have a lot more offerings that are serverless, but there's also a lot of new tools going out there. So when you look at your operational workload, as you move to serverless, make sure you look at the tools you're using to either understand how you use them differently or try out some new tools so you can make sure that you are getting the visibility, the observability you need to be successful using serverless tools. With that, it's incumbent upon me to do a little CloudZero pitch because we are a platform that believes we are a new breed of tool that every SaaS company is going to need. So let me talk for a few seconds about what CloudZero does. At CloudZero, our mission is to create a cloud cost management platform for engineering teams. We believe that the current crop of cloud cost management tools were not built for engineering teams. They do what they do incredibly well, but they are often dashboarding tools that finance uses really well and that are great for monthly updates of what your cloud costs are. In the new world where teams are pushing value every day, every week, working in 1 or 2 week sprints, we think you need a new breed of tools. And CloudZero has been built from the ground up to not only leverage these new architectural serverless constructs I've talked about, but to fit into teams that are working that way. So what does that mean? It means that the CloudZero platform can connect to your SaaS platform and understand not only all the costs, but connect it to very specific resources. We've found that with the scale we can achieve with the serverless constructs, we can actually monitor everything in your environment, much like an observability platform, and then give you very time-aware insight into what's changing in your environment, connect that to very specific resources. Because engineering orgs don't care just about what the cost change, they want to know what changed in the environment, what services changed, what configurations changed that caused a cost change. Because if you want to remediate something, you really have to understand what was the underlying code changes and infrastructure changes that led to that. Beyond that, I think we all know these systems are very large. You have a lot of emergent behavior. No engineer is going to be staring at dashboards all day looking for issues. So we also have anomaly detection. We will run a whole bunch of algorithms through your entire infrastructure and detect in real time what's changing and what might be anomalous cost changes you want to look into. And then, because again, your engineering department's probably not staring at a dashboard all day, we'll deliver you Slack alerts. We will tell you, by the way, in the last couple of hours, one of your Redshift clusters started costing 3 times as much as it did previously. You might want to look to make sure that that's not something that is mistake and that is actually something that's generating you value. Beyond that, though, we want to be able to push more cost awareness to teams, and we wanted to help with waste detection. As we go into more and more organizations, we're finding out that there are certain patterns that just cost more than others. Our platform can automatically detect those and alert you that there might be small tweaks in your environment that can actually save you money if you do those architectural changes. And at the end of the day, that all gets back to giving you a picture for what are my COGS, what's my cloud costing me, and how much revenue is it generating my company, and how can I increase my margin over time. So we think CloudZero is the best platform for that. And if you're interested in learning more, I'd ask you visit us at www.cloudzero.com, check it out, and by all means, take a free demo and a free trial. We'd love to have you see if you can see the value yourself. Thank you. That is my brief pitch on why serverless is an important revolution in the cloud, and some of the things you should think about as you use it so that you don't end up costing your company a lot more than they expect. At this point, I would like to open it up in case there are any questions out there.
Yeah, sure. So if you have a question for Bill, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we'll go ahead and dive right on in. First question, Bill, has your team made any big cost mistakes?
Luckily, my boss isn't here, so I think I can tell you the answer is yes. So one that comes to mind, again, I think this was a learning opportunity, let's put it that way, is we heavily use Kinesis, as I said, which is Amazon's managed Kafka service, if you're not familiar with it. This is because, to give you a little background, we view our platform as essentially an observability platform. We want to take streams of infrastructure data from our customers, normalize it, and then connect it so that we can give inferences back to those customers. We, of course, do all that normalization, all that enrichment with Lambdas, so they are taking data off of those Kafka streams. We had an engineer who was trying to help a customer out, and they were grabbing some more information for what we took from their infrastructure, and didn't realize that that infrastructure they were taking resulted in these incredibly large objects. Long story short, our Lambdas tried to take in those objects. They quickly blew out their memory and stopped pulling stuff off those Kinesis streams. If you have any experience with Kinesis or Kafka, you know it's really bad when your iterator age grows. We did not correctly set up our alarms for that iterator age, and next thing you knew, we had streams backing up and Lambdas just being called nonstop and failing. So we were basically paying to have our Lambdas be invoked over and over and over again, and not actually going through our backlog of data. It resulted, I forget the exact cost, but in the 2 or 3 days it took for us to remediate that. Luckily, we found it within about 4 hours because of the CloudZero platform, but then took us a day and a half to really remediate how to get that back pressure down. It cost us several thousands of dollars, and that was a very expensive PR from that engineer, and I would shudder to think if it had taken me a month to find, what my bosses would have said. So yes, even us who've been working on this platform and these tools, it's easy to make mistakes.
Okay, all right, great. So here's an interesting question. Why the name CloudZero?
That's a great question. So I was not here at the founding of the company, so I cannot give you the canonical answer. I would say it's some part with the fact that our founder thought the name sounded cool, and it was very easily memorable. But a big piece of it was when we started this platform, we thought that the future of the SaaS industry as a whole was going to change a lot with these serverless platforms. And CloudZero got to that idea that we would create tools that would help people really get value out of cloud and get to what's the CloudZero, the root of all the value there. So again, that's kind of my interpretation of the answer. I'm sure at some point we could get our founder on for anyone interested and have him wax poetically a little bit more about why he chose that name.
All right, great. Okay, plenty of time, guys. If you have a question for Bill, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. Let's see, here's one. How do you manage shared AWS resources like DynamoDB tables and Kinesis streams?
Yeah, that's a good question. One that I was actually just dealing with talking through with a customer recently, because when it comes to cost, that's often one that you want to both understand operationally and just even for a cost point of view. If your shared resources are costing you a lot, how do you allocate that cost to different business units? So somewhat of a dodge to this answer, but I'll say our real answer is we avoid them at all costs. Getting back to the domain-driven and event-driven patterns, we really look to deconstruct our environment so it has as few shared resources. This is for a few reasons. One is back for being cost conscious. You want to avoid synchronous workloads, and shared resources can be a great source of synchronous workloads because you have a bunch of different domains all querying a shared database, and that can be synchronous and it can cause fragility in your architecture. So for the most part, when we talk about our use of DynamoDB and Kinesis, those are almost always single resource use in that we have a domain that is responsible for getting all of your cost data. It will use a Kinesis stream just for that. It'll store things just in its Dynamo table just for that. And if you have something over on the side that is dealing with billing, it has a completely separate set of lambda, a completely separate set of database. So I'd say at a high level, avoid those where you can. It'll make your life much easier, allow you to scale better, use the tool better, and avoid trying to understand when cost mistakes do happen, how to handle them.
Excellent. Okay. All right, guys. If you have a question, please go ahead and use that GoToWebinar control panel. Let's see. There's a question that's come in, but I don't quite understand it. So I'm just going to read it out to you, and then hopefully you can understand what the audience member is asking. It has to do with serverless architecture. It says corns in serverless architecture. I'm not quite sure what he means by corns. Any thoughts, Bill? Oh, pros and cons, and okay, what are the pros and cons in serverless architecture?
That makes more sense. Okay, cons in serverless architecture.
I appreciate it. Okay, yes. What are the pros and cons of serverless architecture?
Excellent. Would probably need a whole other webinar to go through all of them. So
right, yeah.
I'll preface this with saying it's a great question. Serverless is a tool, and go back to the very first slide I had that I believe in, lean, agile, whatever buzzword you want. And if you go all the way back to the Agile Manifesto, it's people and interactions over tools and process. Serverless is a tool. You don't want to go to something just for a tool, and it'll absolutely, like any tool, fail for some problems. So if you have giant batch processes that are very synchronous, I wouldn't even look at Lambda, for instance. There are definitely cons there. So that's one con. There are other things where I'd say there's some cons because serverless is so new. So I talked earlier about making sure your tools can keep up there. I don't want to have this become a referendum on what tools out there are really well suited for serverless versus not, but I think there's still some strides in the community to go when it comes to observability and debuggability. Some of that is that your team has to learn how to treat observability and debuggability a little differently. Some are, I think the tools out there are either different or the old tools are not well suited. But I find those all cons as well because they slow down your ability to respond to change and build out an application. I have found that we have mostly personally in our own personal domain at CloudZero gotten around the bend there, but some of those are things you really have to understand and will be a friction if you want to pick up serverless. Hopefully that answers their question.
All right, great. All right, guys, that looks to be all the questions that we have. I'll give you guys another minute or so if you want to go ahead and get a question in to Bill. And meanwhile, while we're waiting, I do want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded or is being recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to listen to it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. We are going to be sending out an email post-event that will contain a link to access the webinar on demand. Looks like we do have one more question here that's come in. If I want to learn serverless architecture, how should I start?
Good question. Earlier I had a slide on the very basic block I always suggest. So I'd say build a SPA website, have that, dump it in S3 for the actual website, have it talk to an API gateway, to a Lambda, to DynamoDB. That'll at least give you some insight into some of the building blocks. I personally am someone who likes to learn by building. So there's a lot of resources out there. Go start cruising those. But I would say then roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty. Start building something. If you have a current SaaS application, see if you can pull a small thing off. Is there something that's not business critical? Maybe something that's off to the side and lets people do something small, like change their name on the app. Can you move that over to a serverless construct and prove that you can do it? But in the end of the day, there's a lot of great tools out there that you can get started with in an afternoon. I'd say go build something, and that's going to be the best way for you to learn the pros and cons of fitting these tools together in different ways.
All right, great. Excuse me. Okay, well, that looks to be all the questions that we do have. As I did before, I'll give you guys another few seconds here to go ahead and get any last minute questions in. And there's another one. Okay, why not build a microservices based rather than serverless application?
Another fine question. So I don't really see those as a binary choice. I don't see either or choice. And I would say both of those terms have become so popular in the last 5 to 10 years that it's hard to say there's a canonical definition of microservice versus serverless. What I will say is that I think the correct architectures to leverage serverless and microservice architectures are both pointing to a path forward for cloud architectures where you are moving away from monolithic areas that have lots of responsibility to very small domains that have very small responsibility. So I actually think that the overlap between what a well-architected microservice architecture looks for is pretty high with the overlap for what a well-architected serverless architecture looks for. So I don't think there's a lot against each other there. And I would say that the things you've learned, if you have either created from scratch a really successful microservice application or done a transition from a monolith to microservice, will give you a great benefit when you start learning how to use some of the serverless tools. So I know that's slightly of a cop-out, but I actually don't think there's a lot of antagonism between those two mindsets.
Okay, all right. Doesn't sound like a cop-out to me. So, okay. Well, let's see. I'll give folks a couple minutes just to get any last-minute questions in. And while we're waiting, I did mention already about the opportunity to listen to the webinar on demand via the link. The webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website, folks. So you can always go find it there. Just go to devops.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it will be right there waiting for you. Let's see. Well, it doesn't look like we're getting any more questions in. So at this point, I will go ahead and close out the question and answer period. I do want to thank everybody who did submit questions, good ones. I think you stumped Bill once or twice here. So if that's the game we're playing, then you won. So, but great presentation all the way around, Bill. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Awesome. Well, again, I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. And if you have any follow-up questions that you don't think about before we get off this webinar, you can always check in with the folks over at CloudZero, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to answer your questions. Okay, with that, I do want to wait. Actually, before I say goodbye, we just got one more question. And Bill, you ready for it? You want to do it?
Sure.
Okay, what's the URL for the on-demand replay? We don't have that yet, actually, Steve, but we will be sending out the email later on that contains a link to the replay, as I said. So you should be getting it in your inbox. But if you don't, for whatever reason, as I just said, it's going to be on the devops.com website as well. So you can always just go to the webinar section on demand and look in the on demand section. It will be right there waiting for you. So okay, and so with that, I'm going to go ahead and bid everybody a good day. Thank you so much for joining me. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.